Good morning, boys and girls. This is Mrs. Gunter with a story for you this week. But I read it on the internet by author Tony Bezeo, illustrated by Sachiko Yoshikawa. You'll notice I'm using our own copy from our Arlith library, and the reason for that is because I bought this copy directly from the author herself. She even signed it for you. To Arlith researchers who find and evaluate the information they encounter. And there's her name, her signature in her own handwriting. Now, before I recorded this story, I asked Mrs. Bezeo's permission. This is her book. It is her work, and I wanted to give her credit and make sure it was okay with her that I recorded it, because a recording is a permanent record. And she was kind enough to say yes. But I read it on the internet. The first thing I noticed when I walked into class on Monday morning was the bulletin board. I grinned. Who did Mr. Dickinson rope into making all those flags? Just then, Mrs. Skorupski, my librarian, sailed in. I checked her accessories. Yep, she was definitely in on this. She dumped an armful of books on Mr. Dickinson's chair. What's up with the flags? I asked. Oh, this research project is custom made for a factmeister like you, Hunter. Before I could say, factmeister? Carmen Rosa Pena tripped through the door and dropped her half-eaten granola bar on the floor. She scooped it up and took another bite. Ew, disgusting, I said. 5-second rule, Hunter Harris. It takes 5 seconds for bacterial contamination. Says who? Carmen popped the last bite into her mouth. Says the internet. Oh, brother, I muttered. Carmen and her infallible internet. After roll call, Mr. Dickinson dug right in. He flashed a KWL chart on the whiteboard. Who knows something interesting about a U.S. president? Abraham Lincoln was the tallest. Kennedy was the youngest elected. One president was born on 4th of July. Mr. Dickinson typed as fast as he could. Then Carmen's voice cut through all the others. George Washington had wooden teeth. No, he didn't, I said. Yes, he did, she insisted. Hunter and Carmen, Mr. Dickinson said, you seem to have different opinions. Let's start with the source of your information. I read a biography about Washington. A true book, I said. Carmen threw me a withering look. But I read it on the internet. Mr. Dickinson grabbed his laptop. Follow me, class. In the library, Mrs. Skorupski projected the KWL chart onto the board. Oakley dokley, she said. Who wants to challenge anything in the no column? I raised my hand. Hunter is challenging Washington's wooden teeth. We'll highlight it in red and try to verify it, said Mr. Dickinson. Carmen just threw, oh, just you wait and see look my way. I don't think a stuffed animal would actually be named for a president, Patty said. What if the president was Theodore Roosevelt and his nickname was Teddy, I asked. Oh, Patty said, maybe it was named for him then. So let's highlight that in yellow, meaning we'll proceed with caution, said Mrs. Skorupski. When we finished highlighting, Carmen announced, I made a list of all those highlighted items, so I'll check the internet and bring in the facts tomorrow. The internet. Graham and I might not have the internet. We might not even have a computer, but I knew lots more true facts than Carmen, all from books. That's very generous of you, Carmen, Mr. Dickinson said, but actually, I held my breath. Finally, I thought, he's going to set her straight about the internet. Actually, Mrs. Skorupski and I have a different plan. Before I could exhale, Mr. Dickinson said, or added more facts to our KWL chart. to increase the challenge, he said. For homework, choose one red item, one yellow item, and one unhighlighted item, said Mrs. Skorupski. Verify that each one is true or not true, and let Mr. Dickinson know where you found the information. That's called citing your sources. If you use sources from the internet, added Mr. Dickinson, cite them by giving me the URLs. I stayed behind and checked out another Washington biography, plus one about Theodore Roosevelt. Books, the best place to find true facts. The next morning, we met Mrs. Skorupski in the multipurpose room to share our results. The teddy bear was named after President Theodore Roosevelt, Hugh Abernathy said. How did you verify it, Mr. Dickinson asked. His twin, Louis, put a bear on the table. Carmen's sister Frida helped us. Her teddy bear has a tag that says so. Mr. Dickinson tapped the tag. Do we all agree that this is a reliable source? Well, my grandma bought that bear for my sister at the Smithsonian Museum, Carmen said. The Smithsonian! Robert raised his hand. But the Smithsonian didn't make the bear, and companies will say anything about their stuff to make you buy it. Well, I paused. I really hated to admit this. I think Carmen's right, because I read it in a biography of Roosevelt. So if it's in a book, it's true, Mrs. Skorupski asked. Maybe not always, I said, but the author is a professor, and the publisher publishes a lot of nonfiction books for kids, and you had it in the library collection. I know you only buy books with true facts. Excellent evaluation of your source, Hunter, she said. Besides, said Carmen, I read it on the internet. Okay, Carmen, let's pull up your website, Mr. Dickinson said, entering the URL into the location bar. Suddenly, half a dozen teddy bears dressed like famous people filled the screen, accompanied by notes of Teddy Bear's Picnic. Mr. Dickinson clicked on a chubby bear wearing glasses and a safari vest. The teddy bear was named after the 26th President of the United States, Carmen read, Theodore Roosevelt. See? Well, that's the same tag as on Frida's bear, Robert said. They're just trying to sell it. But they couldn't say it if it wasn't true. Carmen's voice shook a little. Or maybe they could, said Mrs. Skorupski, handing us each a copy of her website evaluation gizmo. And here it is, Mrs. Skorupski's website evaluation gizmo. Is it informative? Is the website easy to use? Is it accurate? Ask yourself these questions. Let's use the gizmo to evaluate the accuracy of this website, Mrs. Skorupski said. Robert raised his hand. They're definitely selling us something. I added, the owner is Barry Bears. They might not know much about presidents, but they do know a lot about teddy bears, Carmen said. Mr. Dickinson laughed. That's true. What about the URL, www.barrybears.com, asked Mrs. Skorupski. We all just looked at her. The URL ends in .com, said Mrs. Skorupski, which means it's a commercial business. If it ends in .edu for education, we'd know the information came from a school, a college, or a university. Super accurate, right? Patty asked. Mr. Dickinson said, what if it's an elementary school website with information written by fourth graders? Then it just depends on how smart they are about the internet, Carmen said. Or which sources they used, I snapped, like books. Mrs. Skorupski smiled. Or if they answered lots of questions in the gizmo to make sure the source was a good one. After lunch, Mrs. Skorupski gave us our final homework assignment in the library. I noticed she'd changed her accessories. She said that books weren't always the best source for our research questions. If we wanted to know current weather in Washington, D.C., should we use a book or the internet? The internet, of course, Carmen crowed. Besides, sometimes we don't have a book with the answer, but we do have an internet connection. I wanted to say, sometimes we don't have an internet connection, but then she would know. For homework, prove or disprove one presidential fact using the internet only, and evaluate your website source using the gizmo. Stop and see me if you need to use the computers this afternoon or tomorrow morning, said Mrs. Skrupski. Wouldn't you know it, Carmen and I both chose George Washington's wooden teeth. I spotted Mrs. Skrupski on bus duty after school. I've got Cub Scouts right now and an allergy shot tomorrow morning, I said. So can I use a book for my assignment? Nope, absolutely no books, Hunter Harris. We both laughed. Could your grandma drive you to the public library tonight to do some online research? The Abernathy twins zipped past Hugh, and Hugh yelled, "The public library rocks." Have you ever been there? She asked. I shook my head. I'll write your grandma a note, she said. Ask Mr. Charette to help you. He's the librarian in the children's room. That evening at the public library, I was nervous when Grandma pointed me to the right room and then sat down to read a magazine. But when I walked in, Mr. Charette said, "You must be Hunter. Mrs. Skrupski said you were coming." We got right down to business. Now, I don't know how skilled you are online, so if I tell you something you already know, just humor an old man, okay? I smiled. He was funny like Mrs. Skrupski, but in a quieter way, and without the accessories. Mr. Charette said, let's try a student search engine first. If we need more website suggestions, we can move on to a general one. He suggested I type George Washington, wooden teeth in the search box. Lots of website suggestions popped up on the page. Be patient, Mr. Charette said. This is where the gizmo will really come in handy. We evaluated each website until we finally had one with that was informative, easy to use, and best of all, accurate, right there on the internet. Together we filled out the gizmo for the site and emailed the URL to Mr. Dickinson. Mr. Charette shook my hand. I hope I'll see you regularly now to use our computers and to check out books. The next day was the showcase. Mrs. Skrupski had posted one sheet for each fact on the library walls. When Carmen whispered, "I've got the final proof," I just sat quietly next to her with my gizmo folded in my pocket, smiling like a Cheshire cat. At last, Mrs. Skrupski called us up. Carmen zipped to the chart with a red marker in her hand, and I followed behind. Like a game show host, Mr. Dickinson said, "And now, Carmen and Hunter for the $1 million prize." Just kidding. Did George Washington have wooden teeth? Everything happened at once. Carmen's marker flashed up to the chart. I pushed her hand aside, snapping, "He did not!" And Mr. Dickinson cheered, "You are absolutely right." I blinked. There in front of me was Carmen's bright red circle around no. What? I turned to Carmen. I mean, right. What made you change your mind? I read it on the internet. But this time, I knew how to make sure the internet was right. The end. I hope that you enjoyed that story and that you learned that it's important to evaluate your websites for accuracy and that we will cite our sources when we do our research project next week.